Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Hello, good evening, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to the GSMC TV show podcast brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Priscilla Welch. I hope everyone knows we are finishing up another week, since it is very short because of Labor Day weekend. So, coming up later into the show today, we have, of course, you know how I do, special announcements for one of the greatest TV shows that has been on the CW app for the past couple years. I will not reveal it yet until halfway through the show. But first, I'm going to do today's show a little different today. So we have a fan-based theory made by me between my favorite vampire shows. Okay, and like I said, later on the show, there's a teaser coming up about the latest vampire show that's out right now on the CW app. So, first to begin with, I would like to start off with True Blood. That is a vampire TV show that I'll be talking about for the first part of the show today. Now, True Blood aired back in 2008. And of course, everyone has watched movies, everyone has read books when it comes to vampires, werewolves, supernatural beings, anything that you can imagine. And of course, for some reason, it's always when the girl is still in high school or she's finishing up and going into adulthood. But I, of course, used to watch other vampire shows before I actually got into True Blood. Of course, I have always heard of the show, but I just never took the time to go ahead and watch it. Until, so many people that I know in my life actually told me it's a really good show, you need to watch it. And what I realized with True Blood is there's a difference amongst the other shows, the other movies, the other books out there. And it focuses on someone that's actually in their mid-20s who is a waitress and who is a female, and her name is Sookie. Of course, many of you probably know of this show. And the reason why I'm recommending it to you because you can actually watch the show on so many different platforms, which I'll talk about later. So just to give you a little breakdown of the show, as I said, every girl wants to be with some type of supernatural, not every girl, of course, but those girls or those women that are into this type of stuff wants to be a vampire, a supernatural being. We just want something exciting. So, of course, now, here's how I'm going to do it a little differently after I break it down. Now, I have a theory that because True Blood can also be intertwined with some of the vampire shows that I will reveal later into the show, I want to show you how they're all connected. So with True Blood, it was a waitress named Sookie. And what happens is somehow she's always known other people's thoughts. And everyone thought she was weird and, Whereas in the show on True Blood now, vampires are more out in the open. And they have this certain drink that's like fake blood for these vampires to drink. And where Sookie works at her bar, they started giving out those type of vampire drinks until one day a reoccurring vampire, one of her love interests on the show, which is Bill, he actually is one of the people that actually lived in Bontops for years and years and years and years. I mean, he's pretty old, from the 18th century old. So of course he moves back home and it's he's automatically attracted to Sookie. And of course, the whole episode starts off where she goes and saves him in the woods and everything because some other people wanted to breaking down for like parts, like a car or something, because he's a vampire, depending on his body parts. And it was actually people like other townies that she knew about. And she knew that they were going to do that and take him in the back of the woods and get money for it. But there's a twist, because all along it looked like it was planned, as we find out later in the show, that he was just trying to get to Sookie. And we find out it's because Sookie is a fairy. So if you've watched the show aired from 2008 to 2014. And my theory is that True Blood, Vampire Diaries, the originals, and Legacies could all be connected somehow based off the characters, the star characters of each show. So I would also like to mention how True Blood is different because it has the symbolism in the opening scene. Now, a lot of people don't know this, but the way that True Blood was created, it shows a lot of the history and the culture of New Orleans, specifically also Bon Temps. And the reason why, if you go back and rewatch this opening credit, this opening scene, it's to show you how predators see humans on their day-to-day lives, whether they're going to church, whether they're getting baptized in the country, whether they're going to a store, whether they're drinking, smoking, just, sitting out on their porch in their house. That is how they're supposed to see, which is why it explains like there was blood and there was like a lot of red and green, different type of colors if you go back and watch that scene on YouTube. So a little bit about Bill. He turned into a vampire in 1865 at the age of 30. And he actually was a Confederate soldier in the war. His maker is actually Lorena, but we don't see her also too until later on the show. And sometimes there's some flashbacks here and there. And she does make quite an appearance for like one season straight until she actually gets killed off. So Bill also becomes King Bill. He ends up uniting with Lilith. He's known as Billith if you've watched the show. So I highly recommend that. This show is more for how adults deal with vampirism, how adults deal with werewolves, how adults, like, these are grown people we're talking about. We're not talking about teens. And so we also have Eric on the show, which is Sookie's other love interest, but it was more like he was into her and she wasn't only into him until he had changed in one of the seasons. And he is actually considered a Viking. He's Sweden. He also was turned at the age of 30, but he was turned at 936 AD. And he's supposed to be the oldest and strongest vampire of entire Louisiana. See, it doesn't say the world, it says Louisiana. And later on the show, as I compare this to, like, say, for example, Klaus from the originals and also Vampire Diaries, we'll get to that later. Then we also have Sookie's best friend, which is Tara Thornton. Now, this is where the connection can start between True Blood and the other three vampire shows. For a while, she's also known as Tony because she changes her name and goes to New Orleans, specifically like the Quarter Quell, they call it. And she kind of lives in town, goes by the name of Tony back in 2011 in this part of the season. And she's a fighter. She's a fighter in the ring. And one of the theories is that she could have saw some other people, maybe from some other shows, in the Quarter Quell. And right now, you can go ahead and watch True Blood on HBO Max, Hulu, YouTube TV, Amazon Prime, Google Play, Movies and TV, Vudu, and iTunes. I would, of course, recommend HBO Max. It was on HBO, but there is a big difference between HBO and HBO Max. Like, there's only certain shows that will come up on HBO that may not come on HBO Max. HBO Max is more of a diverse and more explicit part of HBO, so it has like more variety on that part of the app. So a little bit more about the show. As I was saying, Sookie is the fairy. We have Bill, we have Eric, and then we also have Sookie. She also has a brother who we actually thought for a time he was actually going to become some type of panther, a were-panther actually, because part of the show there is one time where he actually gets taken and he thinks he's going to finally turn into something other than just being human. He also dates occasionally one of the like women on the show, not in real life, of course, just his character. And basically that is Bill's like adopted vampire daughter. And she's a redhead. And for a while, like he's one of the characters, honestly, Sookie's brother, that went through a lot of different transitions. Like, one minute he was like on a hating spree. He hates all supernatural creatures, all vampires, until he starts to finally realize that not only because, and his name is Jason, not only because Sookie was in love, and he starts to see that vampires could be something more than just like bloodsuckers. Same thing with werewolves and other supernatural beings. And he realizes that hate could come from anywhere, especially from humans. And he didn't realize that until he started going into like this cult-like church where they were teaching him how to hunt and kill vampires. Until he realizes what they were doing was actually wrong. They were doing it the wrong. And he then went to another transition again, kind of like save his town, like the people that he cares about, whether it's vampire, whether it's werewolf or whatever. Like, especially from the beginning of the show when all he cared about was women, and I mean, sometimes he barely even made it to work. Like, it was just crazy. Or he was like mean to his sister. So I definitely love it when shows have certain transitions in them and you can see the dynamic of the characters. And I feel like that's very important. Now, whenever I watch a vampire show or a vampire movie, I realize that a lot of times there's always this type of trio, which I'll get into more later. And between Sookie, Bill, and Eric, there definitely was a trio. So, but of course, like I said, it was kind of temporary between Sookie and Eric. And then Bill and Sookie were more of like the long-lasting ones. But after a while, there was a time where she didn't want to deal with any of them, and she actually went off to a werewolf. Surprise, surprise. So I think at this point, Sookie's character is just one of those that kind of irk me a little bit. Because she could hold her own, don't get me wrong. But it's like, it's just nothing but supernatural is all around her. I mean, there is even a part of the show that was so, like, devastating where her best friend Tara actually gets killed. And they blame her because she turns her into a vampire, basically, trying to get help from Eric's adopted daughter, which is Pam. And it just, it's just one of those things where, not to get too much detailed into the show, but the show is like really, really good because it's a lot of betrayals, a lot of violence, it's a lot of romance, it's a lot of bromance, sister romance, whatever you want to call it. And it's overall very entertaining. And I think that's very important because it's one of those top shows, like even now on HBO, like even though it ended years ago, it's still one of those shows where you can actually go back and try to break down the storyline and try to figure out the characters. Especially when you first watch the show and binge watch it straight through, you probably think only one way of a certain character. But then you have to think about like their background and where they come from and why they are the way they are. And that's why I love it when like you would think like the one person, like Jason, for example, her brother, would turn out to be the bad guy all the time, but then he transitions into something totally different. You have more respect for his character. So a lot of friends were lost. A lot of family members are lost. You find out some deep, deep secrets, especially when it comes to being a fairy. Like, I've always wondered why Sookie was the one that ended up becoming a fairy, like having fairy blood, but then Jason didn't. He wasn't supernatural at all, but yet they're brother and sister. So it's very weird. But of course, like I said, later on the show, we'll get more into that. So we'll break it down when it comes to Vampire Diaries, the originals, as well as a sneak peek, which I'm not revealing to you yet. But you can definitely, again, recommend watching this on HBO. I believe it's a little cheaper that way. Even Hulu, if you have like the actual like subscription for it, instead of going on like Google Play Movies and TV. But these are just options of what you can watch. And again, it's also YouTube TV and Vudu and iTunes. And you have to just make sure that your phone is compatible with all the apps, especially for iTunes. So if you have a Galaxy or Android, for example, that wouldn't be it. So coming up after the break, we will get into the next show, Vampire Diaries. You don't want to miss it.
Want to know the latest and hottest music hitting the airwaves? Don't be left out. Listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Music Podcast. Keith keeps you on the loop with everything you need to know from pop, rock, hip-hop, and the top 40. And we'll throw in news of your favorite artists, concert and tour dates, and so much more. Listen no further, because this is the gold standard in music podcast.
Okay, welcome back from the break, everyone. If you're now tuning in, we just finished discussing True Blood. Again, you can watch this show on HBO Max, Hulu, YouTube TV, Amazon Prime, Google Play Movies and TV, Vudu, and iTunes. And the reason why the theme today, of course, is all vampires, werewolves, oh my. And I just want to discuss with you all again some of my favorite vampire shows, and I feel like I came up with a perfect fan theory of how they're all connected. So up next, we have Vampire Diaries. Yes, you can share now. This, honestly, I think is my favorite because it's what started the next two spinoffs that come off right after it, which is the originals and, drumroll please, Legacies. You didn't hear that. So, basically, the way Vampire Diaries works, it actually came out between 2009 and 2017. So, it actually came out a year after True Blood, and that is why a lot of people prefer True Blood than Vampire Diaries. But in my opinion, I didn't know about True Blood at the time when Vampire Diaries came out in 2009. So, I actually prefer Vampire Diaries because I love the storyline, and I've binge watched it literally when I was like 15, 16 probably. So a little bit about Vampire Diaries. Basically it's based in Virginia, and it's about this girl named Elena Gilbert who ends up in kind of like another love trio again between the Salvatore brothers, which is Stefan Salvatore and Damon Salvatore. Now, there is a time where the original vampires, which is part of the spinoff of this show, come into Vampire Diaries. I believe somewhere between like season 3 and season 5. And they're introduced. And this is way before they actually was given permission to get their own show. And the reason why I'm bringing them up is because of the reason why they came to Virginia in the first place. Basically, here's how we break it down. Damon and Stefan Salvatore, they actually lived in this town, like in this area, where Elena and her brother Jeremy Gilbert, would technically cousin, because technically Elena was actually adopted, but we don't know that till later on in the show. So technically adopted brother / cousin, that's what they are. And basically their parents die, and we're coming into the show basically like a year or two after her parents die in a car accident. And Damon and Stefan is actually going back to school and trying to be better and everything like that. And whereas Damon, who is the 25-year-old and the older brother, he comes back to town looking for their one beloved that they both fell in love with, which is actually Catherine. Now, Catherine looks exactly like Elena. Here's why. They're doppelgangers. Doppelgangers are basically people over time that are identical to each other, probably based off of the common ancestor or relative, whatever the case may be. Their blood is very, very, very powerful for spells, okay? This is where Klaus and the original vampires come in. Now, really the only vampires that we see so far is the trio, is Klaus and Elijah, brothers and sisters. Okay, now before I get more into them, which will be coming up after the next break, you can actually watch Vampire Diaries on Netflix, YouTube, Google Play, Vudu, Amazon Prime, and also iTunes. Now, Stefan and Damon were turned by Catherine in 1864. That's a big, big year. Now, going back to True Blood, it is actually a year before Bill gets turned. So you see, they're technically older in vampire years compared to Bill. They know a little bit more, I would say, not technically older. So if you look at it this way, Stefan, I believe, was anywhere between like 17 and 19 years old. And then Damon was 25. So they actually were turned a little younger because Bill at the time was 30. So technically he is older, but at the same time, they have more years on him as a vampire when it comes to being a newborn, if that makes sense. So both thought they loved Catherine. Come to find out, Catherine actually really loved Stefan and was really more using Damon. But Damon was fully in love with her. And so was Stefan. At least they thought they were. And she kind of turned like brother against brother. And I remember there was a time in like when they show you the timeline throughout the show, Catherine literally wanted, I think, only to turn Stefan, and Damon got jealous. It was like this whole big thing back in the day, whereas Stefan kind of forced Damon to become a vampire afterwards. And ever since then, Damon kind of blamed him for it. So they kind of had an on and off relationship as brothers, but they're like literally the two famous brothers throughout vampire history. So Stefan actually, he fought, and here's another connection again with True Blood, he actually fought with the Allies. And Bill actually fought on the other side, which is with the Confederates. Again, like I said, Damon was in his mid-20s when he turned, and Stefan was like 18. So my theory is Damon and Bill could have fought together since they both were on the Confederate side during the war at some point in time. And I feel like that's very, very important because they all were turned around the same time. So who knows if they saw each other across the battlefield, or maybe they were just stationed in different states or different counties. But being vampires, they could have come across each other if we intertwined the two shows. So a certain point in time in the show, though, I believe this is where Klaus comes in and Rebecca and Elisha. Now, we don't really see Elisha that much when it comes to like them trapping them, like Elena, Stefan, all them in the school when he actually comes after her. So let me break it down for you. The reason why Klaus wanted to get her doppelganger blood is because he couldn't get it centuries ago from Catherine, which is her doppelganger. This is where the connection is also with the Salvatore brothers, because she's been running from Klaus ever since. Klaus is actually a hybrid, and he's supposed to be the first hybrid. He is a werewolf and a vampire. But his werewolf side was suppressed by his mother, which is known as the original witch, because his real father is actually a werewolf, whereas his stepfather, who was the vampire hunter and is the father of his other siblings, are his real father. Basically, he has to do a spell where you need one vampire, one witch, one werewolf, I believe, or like one doppelganger, and mixing all that blood together on a full moon finally makes him a hybrid. And I can understand why Klaus wanted to do this since he was suppressed and was held back from for over 1,000 years. But it's pretty weird because his family basically, at least the ones that kind of showed that they cared for him at the time, wanted him to just be his true self, which is why they helped him with the spell in the first place. In the process, though, Elena's aunt was killed, and she was like the last living guardian for them. Whereas finally, when Elena turned 18, she was able to kind of do things for the house between her and her brother Jeremy. I believe also a couple other important people had died or almost died as well, but characters are kind of like side characters, if that makes sense. They don't really show up again in the rest of the show. So, going back now, when all that happens and finally Klaus kind of leaves them alone after terrorizing for so long, we then have the original spin-off, which we will get to after the break. And the reason why it's a spin-off is because they actually go to New Orleans. And apparently they used to be like the kings and queens of New Orleans at the time, but it was many centuries ago. So the theory could be, again, I'll go more into it later, a character from True Blood could have seen them in the Court of Quell if we were to put two of the shows together. And also I want to talk about, again, another recap for Vampire Diaries is basically how I said for True Blood, the oldest and strongest vampire in Louisiana would have been Eric. Out of the show for Vampire Diaries, the strongest one would have been Ketsia, actually. You would think also Klaus In my opinion, he is considered the strongest one, but also Silas. Silas was a very powerful witch from way, way back when. He could honestly be around the same age as the original vampires, probably even a little older. And he was actually supposed to be with this woman named Ketsia. Here's the thing with Silas. Silas is the doppelganger of Stefan. Here's the weird thing. Now, we wouldn't see a third doppelganger of them, like how we have Elena, Catherine, as well as Silas's real lover, which is the doppelganger of Elena and Catherine, which means she is older than Catherine. She's the same age as Ketsia and Silas because they're from the same time. Now, I believe this lover, she was also more like a servant compared to what Ketsia was as a witch. So she wasn't noble, but Silas was in love with her. And so what Ketsia did is she came up with the immortality spell, which is basically where you can't really like die in peace like how humans would. You kind of go behind like this curtain, behind the wall where supernatural beings would be. So the immortality spell is what Ketsia created, and that is why she is considered the most powerful. I also would like to say the original witch, Esther, which is the original vampire's mother, she would actually also be, and she's not considered, honestly, the first witch, which is what I don't understand that. If Ketsia was older, and if Ketsia lived way longer and was there before everything, she actually would be considered the original witch, but they don't call her that. They just call her the first witch. And then whereas Esther comes in, she's actually considered the original witch because she made the vampire spell because she wanted her kids to survive. So at the time, it felt sane, it felt right to her. But over the thousands and 1,500 years, it was getting old because of the mark that her kids left. And ever since then, as you can see throughout the show, it goes more in depth that she tried every way to actually take her kids down. It's a pretty sad story. And of course, we have their father, which is the vampire hunter. He's been tracking them basically all their life. And the last time they have seen him really was way before they even came back to New Orleans, was actually back in the day, hundreds and hundreds of years ago in New Orleans as well. And he made them fled. But we'll go more into that once we come after the break, because I can tell you as to why they fled in the first place. So far, I hope y'all think my theory is okay. And if you understand where I'm coming from, and it's cool, first of all, for these shows to actually come up maybe with another spinoff where they involve like all the characters or maybe like the characters' kids. I would really, really love to see that one day. But it's probably not going to happen because these shows, of course, have already ended, unfortunately. So, coming up after the break, we'll be talking about, again, later in the show, about my teaser for you all. And coming up after the break, we'll be talking about the originals next. You don't want to miss it. And you can also watch Vampire Diaries. I highly recommend watching it on Netflix compared to the other apps because you have to pay more of a subscription for it. And of course, it's more money and we don't want to do that. So, let me know what you think of the theory, and we'll be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back. So if you're now tuning in, we're jumping right into our next discussion, which is the originals. If you're, again, now tuning in, we just finished discussing about Vampire Diaries, and right before that was True Blood. Towards the end of the show, again, I have a teaser for you all and some upcoming news about another vampire show that is on the CW app. So, first things first. The Originals, as I stated, is a spin-off of Vampire Diaries. I will be breaking down the show for you. I will be comparing it to True Blood, as well as we're talking about the best love scenes here and who is the most powerful and what can be the connection between True Blood and Vampire Diaries. So this focuses on a lot of the siblings for the Originals. We have Klaus, we have Cole, we have Finn, we have Rebecca, we have Elijah. Later on, we see also a little more flashbacks of how they even had a younger brother who was killed many years ago when they were still kids. And then we also have Freya. Freya is the eldest of them all, and she actually was captured many, many years ago because of a deal between the original vampire's aunt and their mother, Esther. Whereas one of the children, the first of their name, had to be taken as a child, as the aunt's own child instead, since she couldn't have, I guess, children of her own, or she just wasn't with anyone. And Freya ended up becoming a really, really powerful witch because her aunt was considered one, as well as Esther. And again, this was before Esther really dabbled into witchcraft. I think she more dabbled into it when her kids got a lot older. But the main trio, of course, as we see even from Vampire Diaries, is Rebecca, Klaus, and Elijah. Elijah, I would describe, is the most, I don't want to say the most violent, because they all have their violent natures, but the amount of things that he has done just for the word family is beyond ridiculous. Literally. And he covered up a lot of secrets. And Elijah is older than Klaus, but at the same time, Klaus is much more fearful because of the fact he has a werewolf side, because of the fact he has a vampire side. But however, Klaus and Elijah are very close. And Rebecca, their youngest sister, they protect her like nothing. So Klaus is the most powerful, but he can be matched by Elijah and honestly witches as well, and werewolves. And the thing with the original vampires, now going back to Vampire Diaries, the way it spins off is there's this woman named Haley who is a crescent wolf from Vampire Diaries. And the way she's introduced in the show is where Tyler Lockwood, which is also part of the Vampire Diaries cast, is his family is all about being werewolves. And he meets one of these werewolves along the way when he travels off at a certain time in the show in Vampire Diaries, and he meets up with this other werewolf named Haley to kind of figure things out for himself. And everyone knows that she has this crescent moon birthmark, which is her family's birthmark. So little did we know, though, that the way they did it was her and Klaus basically had a one-night stand. This is where it gets interesting. Haley becomes pregnant. Again, we're talking about a werewolf, and we're talking about someone who's already a hybrid. This is the point in time of the show where Klaus already had the werewolf gene, was no longer suppressed, and he was already a full-blown vampire who lived over 1,000 years. Now, this baby ends up becoming a tribid, which is called Hope, but we'll get into that later on. Right now, for the breakdown again of the show, we have also Elijah and Haley, which was a few of the best love scenes. We have Marcel, Rebecca, Cole, and Davina. Now, to explain a little bit about Marcel and Davina, Marcel kind of took Davina under his wing. Davina was actually one of the witches that were part of the Court of Quell who had to be sacrificed one year. Marcel is a vampire, which is he was technically also Klaus's adopted son. When Klaus and his family came to New Orleans, it was still a time of slavery. And when this occurred, Klaus kind of felt like he could relate to the young African American, and he took him under his wing, as well as Elijah did. Elijah at a certain point in time felt more of a father and actually was closer to Marcel than Klaus was. And Marcel also noticed this. They show you many flashbacks of it. And then for some reason, it seemed like Klaus was getting jealous of their relationship, and their relationship kind of had to be like torn apart. But anyway, over the years, Marcel had to make a choice as he got older, and he was raised as a Michelson. And he fell for Rebecca. Him and Rebecca actually were deeply in love, and they have been star-crossed lovers ever since, even after hundreds and hundreds of years when they were coming back into New Orleans. And Marcel, he felt betrayed because they did not take him along when their father came after him, basically tried to burn New Orleans to the ground. He was the one that was there to pick up the pieces and started making his own army of vampires over the years. And that is why he became king of New Orleans. So by the time Elijah and the rest of the original vampires tried coming back to claim what they had, well, you can see where the trouble is. Marcel was not having it at first. And we see that a lot on and off throughout the 3 to 4 seasons of the show. Again, Davina, she became a very, very powerful witch on the show. And she was one of the girls that was used because of old traditions that witches believed in when it came to the ancestors, about sacrificing these witches for their power, so that way the entire coven will have power. But they were supposed to also be able to come back to life once that power is reinstated. However, Damon and Eric are always made out to be the bad guy, and so is Bill and Stefan, who are mostly the naturally good ones, but they have a dark side to them, which is where the connection is. Bill finally spills his deep, dark secrets of what he was really trying to do all along when he was trying to get with Sookie since the beginning of the show. At a certain point in time, again, he kind of links up with Lilith, and he becomes Billith and becomes God, or at least he thinks he is. And he starts just acting weird to everybody that you think he cared about, and just kind of evil. And Stefan, when he turns his humanity off, he becomes a ripper. He can't control himself. He can't control human blood, and which is why he doesn't really drink it. He kind of just survives off of animals. Yeah. And they also keep secrets, they become something more than just any vampire. Again, as I said, Stefan is a doppelganger, and Bill is powerful like Lilith. Another connection. Stefan and Elena doppelgangers are always meant to be, but in the case of Elena and Stefan, it didn't happen. She ended up with Damon instead. And a little fun point to also watch the show, the actress that played Elena and the actor that played Damon actually were together for years while they were filming the show in real life. So that's something cute if you didn't know. So Elena's attracted to Stefan and Damon because of Catherine. Same with how Sookie, she is a fairy, so she was attracted to, well, at least Eric and Bill were attracted to her. And one thing I noticed with Elena and Sookie, their blood is very rare. Elena being a doppelganger and Sookie being a fairy. Klaus, in my opinion, is my favorite. And another thing, the originals were actually from Norway. And again, Eric was from Sweden. So they weren't that far away from each other. If anything, it was about 9 hours away if you wanted to fly from here to there in this time. So for them back then, it probably was, because it probably was like more landmass before buildings and everything like that. But again, being vampires, being hybrids, there could have been a chance where they met each other along the line. So Rebecca was one of those characters where she was the vampire sister, always had to be on the lookout for her brothers, but never got what she wanted. She never wanted to be a vampire. She always wanted to be human. And the reason why I mentioned that Elena gets the cure is because Elena eventually does become a vampire, but she decides to stay one. And you can find out more about that if you actually go ahead and watch that season when she does become one. Also, another connection I'd like to make is before 990 AD was actually around the time that the originals were around. And then they were 1,134 years old as an estimate based on all their ages. Eric was only 1,111. So the original vampires are really the original vampires. And I've always theorized what it would have been like if Eric and Klaus went head to head, because they're both pretty violent in their characters and in their being. So Again, I think it's very interesting how a lot of these characters, especially based off the trios for each of the shows so far, based off the originals, Vampire Diaries, as well as True Blood. Also, Klaus is next to Silas after his death in the entire universe. I also would like to see if maybe they go head to head, because I feel like around the time when the original vampires were there, of course it was many years later, but they had to have come across each other eventually. Because on the show of Vampire Diaries, Silas and Ketsia, they're all over 2,000 years old. So they have over 1,000 years already over the original vampires. So, for example, if the originals were around 1,134 years, depending on their age, then Silas would have been like 2,134. So it's crazy. And again, when Haley got pregnant from Klaus, she actually went to New Orleans. So it wasn't just the original vampires. She actually left the Vampire Diaries TV show as well, because she actually wanted to find out where her family came from, because she was adopted. And she wanted to find out more about her birthmark, which was a crescent. And then later on in the original, she finds out that her parents get killed and she's part of the Crescent Wolf Pack, and it's a lot of nitty-gritty details. At first, Klaus tried to deny that he did have a baby because he was surprised, because it's never been heard of a vampire and a werewolf or any supernatural being like procreating. If you wanted to procreate, you basically would have to have turned someone that maybe you thought would have been perfect for you in another life as a vampire or werewolf, or however it works, any supernatural being. And finally, Elijah is the one that convinced Klaus that this could be something different, a new change for him, because this could be the redemption that actually the entire original family needed, because of all the things that they done and put people throughout the years as being vampires and being the originals. It's like people felt on the show that, or at least their characters felt, because of the history and the background, that just because they were original, they could do whatever they want. They were the kings and the queens. A lot of people felt like it was time for change for that. So as you can see, the different connections, that's just my theory, how a lot of these vampires could have came across each other over the years. But coming up after the break, we'll talk a little bit more about legacies, which will finally fill in those gaps. If you're still confused about the theory, you don't want to miss it.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now, don't bother, what's hot on Netflix, and everything in between. That's GSMCpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Hello everyone, and welcome back. We're now wrapping up this episode so far about vampires, werewolves, oh my. So far we have been talking about my fan theory about the originals, before the break, and we are comparing it to True Blood as well as Vampire Diaries. And now the moment you've been waiting for, teaser trailer of Legacies. Dun dun dun! Okay, so Legacies basically is the spin-off of the originals, and the originals is a spin-off of Vampire Diaries. In the Legacies, this is literally all about Hope Michelson, and of course, the two sisters of the Gemini Coven, which is Joe and Liz, and they are actually the daughters of a Lark Saltzman. Lark Saltzman is also a very big character in the Vampire Diaries world. He is first the history teacher of Elena, of Jeremy, Bonnie, again, Bonnie is also another powerful witch, and is also Caroline. Caroline and Bonnie are the best friends of Elena Gilbert. And Caroline later becomes a vampire, but of course Bonnie stays a witch. And then one moment she's also, what's the word I'm looking for? She was basically the wall that everyone kind of passes through, her being immortal, because at a certain point in time, Bonnie does come back from the dead. Yeah. I think the right term, I can't think of it now, but basically she was the bridge between supernatural beings and the other side. So basically, again, the originals, as I said, in this particular show, the spin-off, now the Salvatore brothers, Damon, of course, ends up with Elena, and Stefan, you'll have to watch to find out what happens to him. But their house was actually taken over by Alaric. Not really taken over, kind of given to Alaric and Caroline, where they started building a school for their kids, or people like their kids. Other supernatural beings that basically have no place in the world, either because their parents just didn't want them anymore, or maybe just a way for them to kind of learn who they are and accept it, but also at the same time learn how to live civil in the real world. And it started off because of the two twin sisters, the two witches, which, by the way, were used for a lot of the different spells in Vampire Diaries because of the fact they're from the Gemini Coven and they're twins, and also from the originals. And at a certain point in time, I believe they were used to take out this very witchy spell off of Klaus, so that way he can die. And then again, like I said, they're mentioned, of course, many times because they're on the show for the legacies. So the characters are Hope, Josie, Liz, Alaric, Landon, Milton, Raphael, Caleb, Sebastian, and many more. Also, Jeremy Gilbert, he actually makes appearance a couple times on the Legacies show. And Matt also makes appearance, which is also one of Elena's ex-boyfriends in high school before she even got mixed up in vampires and werewolves and supernatural beings, before they even knew what was going on really in Mystic Falls. Matt becomes the sheriff. I believe Klaus finally dies. It kind of just takes it from there. Whereas what Hope does on a day-to-day basis with Alaric. Alaric basically takes Hope in as a daughter because Haley also dies in one of the last seasons of the originals. So basically Hope becomes an orphan, and all she has at this point is some of her father's siblings, and then she has Alaric. Alaric kind of took more control of being there for her as a guardian, and she kind of just grew up with his daughters, his twin daughters. Another cool thing with this show and its connection is Liz gets Damon's car. Damon was known, his character in Vampire Diaries, for a very famous light blue Cadillac looking car that she actually gets for her 16th birthday. I believe her and Josie kind of like share the car, but it was only really seen in the previous season 2 of the show. I would like to go more in depth with the other characters and see. I would like the show, to go more in depth eventually in season 3 with the other characters of the Vampire Diaries. Like, for example, what we think may be upcoming, like fans of like the series and of the show, is that Elena and Damon probably by now have kids, because sometimes what they do is when they go to Mystic Falls or show Mystic Falls in Legacies, they show that Elena actually did get what she wanted, her character. She ended up becoming a medical doctor. And of course, she's a vampire, so I'm pretty sure she's using some type of vampire blood to heal patients and is known for Mystic Falls for that. And you would think by now, eventually, her and Damon have kids. So, and once they have kids, what are they going to become? Vampires. Where are they going to go? They're going to go to vampire school, which is the Salvatore school. So I definitely want to see in season 3, and of course other fans as well, is what's going on with the other kids and how there is any relationship between the Vampire Diaries and the originals. because another person that could also send their child there is Rebecca Michelson. She definitely probably will have a child the way the originals ended with Marcel. And we're talking about now maybe another like vampire / human baby. Okay? And this would also be Hope's cousin. So another cool thing about that. Will all older supernatural beings again like put their children there? There has to be like, of course, other like supernatural beings over the course of these two shows that have children, and they probably will all end up going to school here. Let's see. The show is supposed to actually return back in January 2021. Of course, due to the pandemic, it has held back so much, but we know for sure that it's confirmed for season 3. Right now where we left off is Hope did not wake up in season 2, and she's still trapped somewhere in her mind. I believe also Landon, her secret lover, he was trapped somewhere too, I believe. So you can actually watch this show on the CW, Netflix, YouTube, Google Play, Vudu, and Amazon Prime. I would recommend watching it again on the CW. If you've listened to my other episodes, CW is a free app. You don't have to sign up. You just have to accept the cookies. If you're doing it from a website, or if you're doing it from an app on your phone, you could just download the app and that's it. For Netflix, it would have, honestly, the first, I think, couple seasons, so you could do it that way as well. But of course, when the new episodes start coming out, you definitely want to go on the CW app because it will have the updated episodes compared to Netflix. So I also want to see, if possible, if there's, again, maybe any relation to like when they do go to New Orleans, like who could still be alive from the cast of True Blood, and the relation again between how, now that I get into it, is Tara from True Blood. When she was fighting as Tony in the Court of Quell, again, she could have came across even Hope. She could have came across as well to Elijah, Rebecca, Haley, and Klaus, and all the cast of the originals. Overall, I think out of all these characters, if I wanted to see a fight head to head, it would have to be Klaus. It would have to be Hope, because Hope is a tribrid. And it will have to be Eric and Damon. I feel like they are the most powerful ones to kind of hold their own in a battle. Silas eventually dies from Vampire Diaries, so I wouldn't consider him anymore on this list. And plus, my favorite brother for the Salvatore brothers has always been Damon, so I definitely would choose him as a champion for that fight. The best love scenes, I think, so far for Legacies has definitely been the relationship between Landon and Josie. Now, Landon is usually with Hope, but I don't really like their relationship together. I actually wanted Hope to be with Raphael, which is the werewolf, only because I feel like Hope needs to lean in more to her vampire side. So actually, I would prefer her to be with a vampire, because the most that she uses is actually her werewolf side. And her witch side is definitely a day-to-day thing. Like, she only wolfs out when she needs to, and that's usually barely on the show. And she actually becomes like a white grayish wolf. To see her as a vampire, she hasn't done that yet. I think she would obviously still have to die to really do that. But her blood is very special, which is what she has in common as well with Suki and Elena. And her blood is special as a tribid because it has the witch blood, it has werewolf blood, it's vampire blood. But not only that, her grandmother is known as the first original witch. Her father is known as the first hybrid. Her mother is a crescent wolf. And we find out Haley, being a crescent wolf, she actually is from one of the royal families of being an alpha. And they have many powers too, because the man that she actually married on the show, who also comes from another family of being alpha, once they were tied together, they actually got her powers being part of her werewolf pack. Here's another cool thing. In the originals, from the first few episodes, when Hope is finally brought into the world, Hope actually turns her mother, while still being in her womb, into a hybrid. So Haley did not turn into a hybrid from Klaus. Hope actually turned Haley. And because that was her mom, and that was who she was carrying on the inside. Because Haley was already a werewolf, and it was kind of like the power that she had already in her, it turned her into a hybrid, which is why on the show Haley was able to kind of get more powerful because of that. And that's kind of a cool story, I think. It kind of it reminds you, and not to talk about Twilight, but it kind of reminds you of Twilight a little bit, between like Bella and her daughter Renesmee. Okay. So, I would also love to see, again, if a few of the other characters, like, for example, Bonnie, which is, again, Elena's best friend, if she would actually come on the show for Legacies. And especially Caroline. That's another big one. Caroline is supposed to be working with Alaric, and her name is the only one that is mentioned, but she never appears on the show. Now, the real actress that played Caroline Forbes, her real name is actually Candace King, I believe. She just didn't want to do the show anymore. I believe that's what she said in one of the articles. That if you go ahead and search it up on, like, just Google search it, she just doesn't want to do vampirism and all that stuff anymore. So at this point, I read another fan theory that they think she should probably just be killed off the show. And honestly, it makes sense, because the only other time that Josie never really sees her, it's actually Liz. Between season 1 and season 2, when season 2 started, Liz actually was on a whole, like, trip traveling the world with her mom. And that was the only time she's really mentioned, besides one other time, I believe, in season 1, when they're like, when is mom coming? Why is she never here anymore? Because she always used to be at the school. If you watch the originals, Klaus, I believe, talks to Caroline, and Haley finally does the deed when she drops Hope off for the first time, because of this 7-year gap that happens between Hope and the rest of her family. And she actually then starts going to the Salvatore school. So it's very interesting how, again, they all tie together. A lot of these characters, a lot of these trios, again, Elena, Damon, Stefan, Sookie, Bill, Eric, Klaus, Rebecca, Elijah. A lot of their stories and their backgrounds, in my theory, in my opinion, they literally could have seen each other. They literally could have met each other. Don't forget Tara. It connects it all. And the way I came up with this theory was, one day when I was watching True Blood, there was a scene where Tara goes out for a smoke, or Tony, I should say, in New Orleans, in the Quarter Quell. And they show a scene of the Quarter Quell, and it looked exactly as one of the scenes that, if you watch the originals, that's literally majority of the show. The Quarter Quell is where everything happens. So again, if you like this theory, there's more on the way if you keep listening to this episode. I would just like to thank you for listening to our show today. And yeah, I feel like this is literally like one of the coolest theories ever between vampires and werewolves. So if you have suggestions, like, definitely let us know. Again, like, it's putting all these characters together. It's really fun, and I definitely want to think more about, like, other theories that we could put together, because I honestly think it would be so cool, like, the way, honestly, if they all could have met each other way back when. Again, like, Eric being 1111, and then the original brothers and sisters being, like, 1134. Silas honestly could have met them too at a certain point in time. So it's pretty cool, again, to put this all together. And again, you can watch most of these shows on HBO for True Blood, and you can watch on Netflix for Vampire Diaries. They have all the seasons, and you can also watch the originals also on the CW as well, and Netflix. All the seasons are up there, but of course we have to wait for season 3 for Netflix. Okay. So again, thank you for listening to the GSMC TV show podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I would like to ask that you please remember to subscribe to the show and write a nice review. That really helps us. Also, if you can please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thank you and have a good night. Pre out.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Television Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.